Hello from wherever you are, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in both French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. The webinar is also streamed live on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. I would like to mention that this webinar is made possible because of the support from our partners and sponsors. To mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and cashewinformation.com. Before inviting Jim for today's session, let me remind you that the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place at the GNICC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania from 18 to 22nd of November this year. If you register now till August 31st, you can enjoy 40% off all your conference rates. Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
All good, thanks. I'm just back from a trip to Turkmenistan. I was working on almonds and pistachios with the International Trade Center. Do you know what? It reminded me how far the cashew sector has come on processing. Really interesting. And so I thought today we'd have a look at processing in Africa and its development, as well as a chat about the markets.
Sure, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stella. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. This is what I've got for you today. We're going to talk markets, some of the trends and some of the trades. We're going to have a look at the crop update. We'll have a look, as I said, with processing in Africa and how it's developed, where it is, and maybe a little bit of where it's going. And after we've gone through those few things, I'd invite anyone to ask a few questions, give a few comments. They're all valued, they're all useful, and they add to the event. So if you've got something, don't hesitate. Get in touch. You can use the chat, you can raise your hand. Whatever way you want to communicate, we're here to listen and to react. So let's get started. But before we do, let me just remind you that all of these sessions, all 77 of them now, are online on the African Cashew Alliance YouTube channel. So there you can access video of the charts. Might even be interesting to look back a year ago and see what the situation was before the market took off, so to speak. Anyway, they're all there. Have a look. If you ever have any interest in any of them or any questions, don't hesitate. Right at the end, you can see my contact details. Feel free to contact me. If I can help, I will. So let's start. Have a look at markets. We're going to have a look at markets. We're going to have a look at trade, imports and exports, and we'll have a look at some of the trends around those too. So I think the main comment in an interesting period, but not particularly volatile period of the last few weeks, is that kernels prices remain quite resilient. And the way I see it, there's pressures both ways at the moment, which is tending to balance the scale. Yes, it's dropped down a little. It's picked back up again in the last 10 days. Influences for lower prices and influence for higher prices. First of all, the lower prices. Well, I think we're probably looking at significant kernels inventories in some markets, probably mainly the United States. We're looking at good crops just about everywhere. Up to now, everyone's forecast really good crops. There is a certain amount of economic uncertainty. The prospect of import tariffs, though not necessarily on cashews, but import tariffs could depress economies, and that's creating economic uncertainty, especially in the US, but also in the European Union, and to a lesser extent elsewhere. We have the impact of price rises, and we talked about that the last time back, a couple of weeks back, when we spoke about the impact of price rises on demand in key markets and how we'd seen that in some markets, China and the Middle East particularly, but that it was beginning to bite in others, Western markets, markets where distribution is mostly through supermarkets. And we also talked about the impact of lower forward sales as buyers waited to see how the crop would come in. So several factors contributing to pressure for lower prices. What's the other side of the coin? What are the factors that are contributing to higher prices? Well, first of all, I think that the lower than normal levels of forward cover, so that brings buyers back to the market more regularly than they otherwise would. You'd often see situations where either through importers or directly, the roasters and packers cover themselves for 6, 8, 12 months forward, even further in some cases, and then they're out of the market. That feels and looks very different to a situation when buyers are regularly in the market, even if the volumes are less. That's one factor. Second factor is the current RCN prices, which also are holding up a little bit, possibly due to a later crop in Cambodia, but they're holding up a little bit and they're out of line with kernels prices, and that makes it more difficult for processors to sell forward. Other factors related to operation of processing. So profit margins have been under pressure. They've been under pressure for some time, despite the rising prices in 2024. Rising costs, particularly costs of energy, but also costs of labor. And the other side of the trade war impact is that it could also increase prices. For example, if we got increased almond prices in Europe, would buyers tend to look more at cashews? It's a thought. So we have at the moment a number of factors, some of them strongly pushing prices lower, but others maintaining prices. And I think in this balance, we see the reason behind the resilience of cashew kernel prices so far this year. As I said the last time, and I wanted to come back to this because I always call this a dangerous time of year. What I mean by that is that it's a time of year when it's easy to make mistakes. It's a time of year when volatility is often at its greatest, and it's a time of year when things may not be as they seem. So last time we talked about the impact of distorted market information, the lack of policy announcements, the absence of good, reliable crop estimates, the vacuum created by that being filled by gossip and rumor and myth, which is sadly always a factor in the cashew sector, and that leading to speculation, which in turn feeds the vicious circle. Well, where are we now? What are the factors that are influencing now? So I looked at it from 2 points of view and I thought, what's the market impact of these different factors? So February, March, April, I think that we're looking at greater impact of news in terms of supply. So what's happening now is in West Africa, the regulations are being announced. I think that's almost finished at this point. We still have a lot of gossip and rumor and myth, people talking about, I saw one broker talking about a crop failure. Well, that's pretty wrong, isn't it? But nonetheless, it feeds into the mill, as we say, grist to the mill. And the harvests are coming in. So at this time of year, February, March, April, the influence of the Northern Hemisphere crops and supply factors. But as we go on, as we come into April, May, and beyond that, the demand factors start to dominate. So we'll start to ask ourselves, will buyers continue to buy cashews at these prices? Will roasters take forward cover if they feel that there's a greater period of economic uncertainty or possibly even recession? How will they react to that? So demand and supply chain factors start to have a greater influence as the year goes on. And we're just on the cusp of that period now. As we come into April, people start to look a little bit more at demand because their questions on supply, for the most part, have been answered. So let's get into something on prices. So I had a look at 320 price trends. I don't often speak in detail about price on this event. It can change so often. And anyway, there's so many different prices and so many different discussions around price that I tend to avoid it because it can be misleading. But we'll have a look today and you can see the trend. So here's our trend in prices, May 2019 through to April 2025. And we see the big price increase and we see the trends. Now, interestingly, if you analyze that trend in a simplistic fashion, it still is in a slight downtrend, which is remarkable thinking of where we were before. As recently as 2021, we were up at 345. As recently as last May, June, we were up around 360, very briefly, but we were there. And when we look at this, I thought, let's have a look at the averages. So when we look at the 2-year average and the 5-year average, they're around about the same, around about $2.90. So whereas these prices today, and for the purpose of this, I've taken the price around $3.30 FOB for 320s. That would be 330 FOB Vietnam. African kernels would be 20 to 30 cents higher. Indian kernels will be higher again. So we're a little bit over the 2-year average, we're a little bit over the 5-year average, but we've got to take into account that both of those include the 15-year low period that we saw surprisingly in 2023 and into 2024. And that was based on primarily on economic problems that kicked off in 2022. So we are now 11.5% higher than the 2-year average. The market is 27% higher than it was in April of last year. And prices are at the average price of the last 12 months, which is interesting. So we have seen a relatively narrow range, by the standards of previous years, a relatively narrow range since the market spiked up and then rebounded in May and June of last year. So looking at this, what we probably can say that during those 2 periods in last year, there was limited or lower than normal forward buying. People were negotiating contracts because they were experiencing defaults, so they were buying additional material. They were trying to get out their low price shipments, but they probably weren't too far forward focused because prices appeared high compared to previous months. And it would be a reasonable conclusion at that time to think that prices would again return toward, well, possibly even sub $3 a pound. Now that hasn't happened and it doesn't look likely. So when we look at this, what we can say is that the majority of the forward cover is priced at or below today's rates. So forward cover is well priced. That doesn't mean it's down here at the very low levels. It's somewhere in this region. It's probably, for the most part, somewhere between $3.20 and $3.40. Second factor is that most inventories at destination, because they will have been shipped in during last year, are priced below today's market price. So that creates a buffer. And it means that the motivation for importers particularly to try and push market prices down is less than normal. Normally at this time of year, most of us as importers, certainly in the past when I was an importer, you'd want low prices so you could take your cover and work your way then through the year. Probably a little bit different now because anything that's bought is below the market and people would be tending to be concerned about the possibility of defaults, but they would also be concerned that prices might fall. So let's not undermine what we own by pushing the market down. And that's adding to the general resilience of the 320 prices for the time being. Second factor, let's have a look at the raw cashew nut price trend. So I've done this on a much longer period of time. It's back to 2015 all the way through to the last price was recorded on Monday. And so what I do is analyzing the market. We put in all the different prices from different origins. I've named 6 of them here: West African, East African origins. Others are also included, but not shown. And then we work out a world average. So what we do is we equalize the quality. We bring it all back to £48. It's theoretical calculation, of course, and we work out an average. And what we can see is that clearly, again, the market's moved up. But the question is, how does this relate to the current kernels prices? So let's have a look at this market and let's see if there's, when did we last see this kind of movement? Now, first of all, I think interestingly, the average price since 2015 is almost exactly the current market price on the index, which is kind of interesting. So we've got average kernels prices, 11% over the 5-year average, and we have roughly average raw cashew nut prices. But a lot of other things have changed in that period. But let's look at a couple of periods of volatility. There are two in particular. One is back during COVID-19. So the market had fallen early 2020. The market was expected to turn around and rise in early 2020 by most of us. COVID came along, the market fell. As the year went on, people started to realize that actually COVID could be a bullish factor. Crops were lower, or collection was lower. Crops were coming slower to the market, and demand during that period was very strong. If you recall, 2021 was a record year for demand at that time because of the impact of lockdowns in many of the markets. So that was one period of volatility. And the second period of volatility was last year. The catalyst for that was the suspension of exports from Ivory Coast. So if we look at this, we saw last year the market spiking up after a long period of low prices. In my view, too low prices. And if you were with us a year ago in March, you would have heard us talking about this has to go up simply because it's been too low for too long. So that was the reaction there. The catalyst, not necessarily the absolute cause, but certainly the catalyst for the move was the suspension in Côte d'Ivoire. Today we're at a different situation. We're at prices which are just at the end of a short period of about a year when prices were high or too high. Now, what makes me say they're too high? Well, if their RCN prices don't match kernels, then they're too high. Simple as that. Because ultimately, this business works because people consume cashew kernels. If processors can't profitably process them, then we don't have a business. So looking at it, we're now in a situation where prices, although they're at average levels, they're in a different environment. We've not come through a period of low prices. We're just coming out of a period of high prices, and we've seen this correction. Question mark is the correction over? Or are we at the beginning of another period of price volatility? So if we look at prices over the last 5 years, it gives us a little bit of a better clue. So although we are at the 10-year average prices, we're significantly about $100 above the average price over the last 5 years. So this is just pointing to, let's look at kernels and say we're close to the typical kernels price of the last 5 years, but we're above the RCN price. So that starts to say to us that raw cashew nuts are overpriced. So if we're asking the question, what's going to give here? So something has to give. If kernels prices and RCN prices don't match for processors to make a margin, something's got to give at some point. Either the RCN has to come down or the kernels have to go up. Looking at this, and we're just looking at numbers here, we're not looking at market sentiment, we're looking at the numbers. This says to us that raw cashew nut prices are more likely to come down than cashew kernel prices are to go up. Let's focus in on that a little bit. And let's have a look at maybe origin-wise. So the blue bars are the current prices, cost and freight, and these are offered prices. Okay, so these are not necessarily traded, these are offered prices that we pick up in the market from all of those quotes we get from different importers and traders every day. They're all adjusted to £48, So if it's a high quality £52 RCN, it's adjusted back to 48 to try and make the comparison. Blue is 2025, red is 2024. Obviously, all prices are higher now than they were a year ago. That's not news to anyone. By how much are they higher is more of an interesting question. Now, when we look and we see countries like Guinea, Togo, Burkina Faso on the current prices, we see that the black bar, which is the change in the average price over the year, it's low. So those are somewhat undervalued compared to last year. But when we look at the two major origins, Cote d'Ivoire and the current prices, and Ghana, both would appear that the RCN price has moved up more than the equivalent kernel's price. So this would again lead me to conclude that in these major origins right now, we're still to find the real price. There still is a moment, a potential that the international RCN prices will drift down a little bit. Now, there are obviously complicating factors in that, and there are factors that give us more indications of where it might go. So let's have a look at processing. And let's ask the question, do the current prices work for processors? So I've taken Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana because those appear to be the two that are out of line. And I've calculated the average cost of kernels for a processor. This is not sales price, this is cost, and it's gross cost. So don't think that cashew kernels are processed really cheap at the moment. They're not. This is about the cost of operations. We do two things. We calculate the average cost of kernels based on Ghanaian prices and quality, and then we calculate the cost of the 320s within that mix. And what we see is that when we apply the market prices, that the red is the international market, that the margins for Vietnamese processors based on current international prices are non-existent. And even for Indian processors, so an Indian processor processing Ghanaian good quality, netting out £49 and selling it in the Indian domestic market, yeah, can probably make a margin, but there's nothing particularly attractive about that margin. It would be a gross margin of about 14%, which means you've got to pay from the 14% finance, administration, tax, and of course you've got to make a margin. So this doesn't look like a particularly good calculation, at least based on 320s. So when we look at this, I think we can conclude that the offers from Cote d'Ivoire and to a lesser extent from Ghana do not make a profitable calculation for processors based on today's kernels market. Even for Indian processors who operate in a market where kernels do trade at much higher prices than in the international market, even if they bought and sold at today's prices, they'd only be making this 14.5% gross margin, which isn't enough to cover costs and make a margin. So we are looking at a market where we can see that for most of the volume that's to come to the market, we're out of line. Okay, let's continue our discussion on price and price trends. So are prices sustainable in 2025? Are the current prices sustainable? So let's have a look at a few of the factors. We talked about the resilience of kernels prices, and I think that prices have been somewhat supported so far by later crop arrivals, particularly in Cambodia, and the lower carry-in of raw cashew nut stocks. In fact, the carry-in of stocks this year is lower than in any of the previous 3 years. We know, as we've just discussed, that RCN prices are above the kernel's equivalent in the marketplace, which does make business quite difficult. We know that kernels buyers have waited and that they have been rewarded for waiting because they have been able to buy in January, but particularly February and March, they've been able to buy cashew kernels cheaper than they might have bought them earlier in the year. We know that they still have some business to do. They've done well buying the dips, and we know they've still some business to do, which keeps them in the market. And as I was said earlier, and I think that needs to be emphasized, if there's someone in the market every day or every week, it feels very different to a situation where buyers are covered, even if the volumes are the same. So someone coming into the market and covering themselves for a year gives a very different sentiment in the market than if that person comes in every week and buys something and builds up their cover over a period of time. And that's where we are now, and that's adding to the sustainability or to the resilience of prices. We also know that the current kernels prices can work for roasters. I'm talking about good quality cashew kernels from Vietnam. 320s around $3.30. 240s actually look great value at the moment. Maybe you buy them 10 cents above that. And if we're talking African cashew kernels, we're looking at prices somewhere between 350 and 360 FOB for close to market sustainable African cashew kernels. But what we don't know yet, and this particularly applies in markets of the West, we don't know what higher retail prices and the potential economic downturn, how that may impact demand. And it's not clear cut. So we have the potential impact of import tariffs and trade, which could have a short-term impact on economic confidence, but probably the impact of tariffs takes a longer time to dig in. On the other hand, we have in Europe inflation very much coming under control. So we have a situation in Europe where the most recent inflation figures suggest to us that interest rates may be dropped again. So in Europe, we have this mixed messages. In the United States, for now at least, looking at the stock market, looking at the economic commentary, the US may be headed into a difficult period due to its actions on trade and actions on tariffs. So looking at this situation, it seems to me that over the coming months, the availability of raw cashew nuts will increase as the crops come in, as those raw cashew nuts are shipped to destinations for processing, and as they're processed in African countries. That means that the upside on kernels price is limited, probably very limited, without something dramatic, and it's very late in the year for something dramatic. It's limited. But kernels price levels are workable. So you have, on the one hand, people who've already bought and with inventories who would like to defend the value of those inventories. And on the other hand, you have a good calculation. You take $3.30 FOB for a good quality cashew kernel, and you can turn that into a product which you can make a profit on in the retail markets. So that we're left with the question, how would an economic downturn impact demand, particularly in the US and EU? And I'm focused on the US and EU in this case, because it seems that that's where the economic impact would be greatest in the short term. If we look at important markets, India, the most important market, it's unlikely to have a short-term impact. If anything, it might support the consumption of cashew kernels. If we look in China, one of the fastest growing markets, we already have seen the impact of higher prices. So it seems to me unlikely in the short term that we're going to see any further problems or distress. And I'm going to look at trade in a moment, and we get an idea of how that's been impacted and how that may have changed as prices have risen. So let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at demand. And the best short-term indicator of demand is shipments from Vietnam. Vietnam has 89% of the US market, 72% of the EU market, 95% of the Chinese market. It's a really good indicator of international trade. So when we look at exports from Vietnam over the January-February period, we see exports were down by 28% on the first 2 months. Now, we need to temper that comment by looking at 2024. 2024 is by far the record export period for the entire year, never mind for Jan, Feb. So when we look at this and we say 28% down, we go, yeah, that's a huge decline, but we need to compare it with other years. So if we compare it with 2023, it's comparable. It's only about 8% of a change, but it's about 8% up. So that's interesting of itself. It would appear, initial conclusion, we are certainly not going to see a year like 2024 for demand. We are certainly not going to see double-digit rises in demand anywhere. But we may see a year like 2023, which wasn't a bad year. And we may well see a year in which the production and the consumption match 20. If we look at Vietnam's exports to some of the key markets, just ask my colleagues at ACA to have a look at the interpretation channel. The French channel is coming across me at the moment. We're hearing both. If you'd have a look at that for me, please. So back to the subject, demand trends on kernels. If we look at Vietnam's exports to some of the key markets, so I looked at the top 6 in Europe: UK, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and France, China, the United States, and the UAE as an indicator of demand in Western Asia. Well, we can see clearly that, as you'd expect, imports are down, or exports from Vietnam are down in each of the 3. So, and significantly so. Shipments to China down by 56%, shipments to the US down 33%, the UAE down 38%. Europe looks a little bit less impacted. It is interesting. Europe seems to be maintaining at least a good share of the gains from last year at this early stage. Now that may be for seasonal reasons, it may be for pricing reasons, but it would be encouraging from a European point of view, particularly as tenders and buying now in Europe has taken place and demand does begin to look resilient. But what we see in these markets, China is a price sensitive market, the US is a somewhat price sensitive market, and the UAE is also a price sensitive market. So we are seeing reaction to prices, especially in China. And this is only continuing a trend that started in the middle of last year. So second half of last year, Vietnam's shipments to China were significantly down. You may have seen that the last time we talked on the GME, we analyzed Chinese shipments from last year. So what we're seeing, I think, is that the record export trade, this massive increase last year, is impacting trade this year. People anticipated higher prices. They looked at the market a little bit differently. Maybe they built some inventories. Maybe they bought early and then they stopped buying. So we're not seeing forward buying. So people have been waiting. Now, you would expect as we get into April and May, as those demand side factors start to take over in how the market is viewed, we're going to see more buyers into the market and they will be buying. But they will support prices when they come to market, how they come to market, and in what volume they come to market will influence exactly where prices settle in the coming weeks. We'll have a look at RCN now, and we're going to look again at Vietnam as an indicator. Vietnam is the biggest importer of raw cashew nuts, as you probably know. And if we look at Vietnam's imports through to the first half of March, so January, February, first half of March included, they're down by about 25%. And what we see is that they're majorly down from West Africa, down from Cote d'Ivoire, down from Ghana, and down from Nigeria. Now, Nigeria, Ghana, even Cote d'Ivoire, these are not hugely significant numbers. So saying they're 68% down means something like 30,000 tons. It's not hugely significant. What may be significant or more significant is Cambodia. So imports in the first 2.5 months of the year from Cambodia in 2025 were just over 38,000 tons compared to 75,000 tons in 2024. Now that would lead us to start to think that there is a later crop in Cambodia, and when you speak to people in Cambodia, that too is what you hear. Now I'm not hearing that means that the crop is significantly lower or that there's in any way a major crop problem in Cambodia. In fact, the market price, as we'll discuss shortly, indicates that there isn't. But what has happened is, of course, that processors in Vietnam, through their activities in East Africa, have imported 101,000 tons from Tanzania. That's 90% up on last year. It's almost double what was imported last year in the same period. So there is a strategy amongst Vietnam processors of making sure that their early season needs are covered, and they've done that by buying in Tanzania. Unfortunately, Tanzanian raw cashews, very high quality, but in this case also pretty high prices for the most part. That means that the inventory, whatever's left in Vietnam right now, is high priced inventory because it's Tanzanian, it's Cambodian. That's also a factor supporting prices, at least in the short term. So overall, imports down significantly by 100,000 tons over the year. And exports, if you convert the difference in exports into raw cashew nuts, so I use 22%, 0.22 for the conversion factor, that's a net yield factor, including processing losses. Exports down about 129,000 tons, imports down about 102,000 tons. Pretty much balanced, to be honest, and there's not a huge difference. So the fact that imports are down doesn't necessarily mean that there's a crisis or a lack of inventory. Where the imports are coming from means that there may be more larger nuts around. Cambodia will give more 160s and 180s. Tanzania will give more 240s. And that may be part of the reason to explain why the large nuts and the 320s have gotten a little bit closer in price over the last 6 or 8 weeks. So relatively balanced, low-key situation. In fact, when you look at the year so far, it looks a little bit like 2023. It's 2024 that looks like the anomaly rather than 2025. So let's look at some of the early indicators. So we're still talking about demand primarily. And what we're seeing is that kernels demand has been impacted last year and into this year in the more price sensitive markets. Secondly, buyers, particularly forward buyers, are being very careful in their approach. They've made sure not to be caught with high prices in a falling market in anticipation of a big crop. They waited, and so far that's worked for them. It's worked more for kernels buyers than it has for RCN buyers so far, but it has worked. In terms of Vietnam, the imports are down, which shows caution on the part of Vietnamese processors, but they're actually down less than exports. The reason then you would say that there might be a tightness of inventory in Vietnam is lower carry-in stocks at the beginning of the year, a later crop in Cambodia, and later entry into the West African market. Balanced by additional imports from Tanzania, but that balance will go out of kilter. So what you would suggest at this point is that processors in Vietnam need to see Cambodian raw cashew nuts coming, and they are beginning to see that, and processors in India and in Vietnam should be just about ready now to get going, and we have seen that over the last 10 days significantly in West Africa. Problem is, the prices in the key suppliers in West Africa are a little bit too high to be justified in the current kernels market. And that's always the issue. I mean, if you enter the market and you buy at prices that you think are too high, you're supporting those prices. If you wait, you're risking that you won't have the material in time. So particularly when carry-in stocks are low, it's very difficult to do that. When Vietnamese processors have 750, 800,000 tons from Cambodia under their belt, they'll look at this a little bit differently, I think. So the ingredients are there. If there was a crop problem, the market would react, and it could react quite seriously. But that is, as you see on the slide, that's a big if. There's no real indication of that right now. So let's have a look at production. Let's have a look at the crop update to see what we're hearing and what we're seeing from the major producers. So what I'll do is I'll have a look at 3 of the major producers, and then we'll have a look at other countries one by one. So we start with the biggest producer, Côte d'Ivoire, and it looks so far so good. Situation seems to me that processors are well sold to the European market on their whole grades. RCN buyers from abroad for international trade in RCN are interested, but there's something of a price standoff, and there's really no reason for regulators to intervene as they did last year. We think about 40% of the crop is committed. So that would include nearly everything that processors will need, and somewhere between 80 and 120,000 tons committed to the export trade at this point. So as it stands, what we've seen is good arrivals based on high on-farm yield. We saw early in the season very high quality, particularly in the more southerly growing areas. As you know, cashews grow in the northern half of the country, in Côte d'Ivoire, and the lower part of that has offered very high quality kernels this year. Outturns from cutting tests, 50, 51 pounds reported, and prices tend to support that early in the year. Prices are lower now because quality is lower now. As the crop moves further north, it does tend to diminish in quality, and people are telling me they're seeing quality around 46 pounds at this point. That's not a problem, by the way. That's not an issue with the crop. That's the usual situation in the country. Right now, the processors seem to be well covered. They have tended to withdraw from the market. They bought early around the minimum price, a little bit higher than that. They bought 425 is the minimum price. That's CFA per kilo. They paid up to 450. Some paid even 500. They appear to be well covered, and for the most part, they're not in the market at the moment. Export trade has started. We're guessing it's above 100,000 tons committed. Could be more. Farm gate prices are easing back. So farm gate prices started at the minimum. Now, the minimum this year was quite a high price. People questioned whether that would be sustainable. And it is quite likely, if it wasn't for the minimum pricing, that farm gate prices would be below 400 CFA at this point. But they are trading around the 425. That's around $700. Put together, that works for processors. It works for exporters too, taking taxes and transportation and everything else into account. We think that selling pressure can build now at the farm gate for what's left. We think after Ramadan and there is like some selling pressure as farmers start to want to turn some of those cashews into cash, and the harvest continues, particularly in the northern part of the country. So generally speaking, quite a good outlook. My guess is that this year is a big crop. The indicators that we have compared to previous years would indicate a crop up here approaching record levels. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we had a record crop in Côte d'Ivoire this year. Other estimates, and I think the official estimate is down around the 1.2 million tons. We'll see. But I've seen some yield per hectare figures for certain important producing areas. And although they're not rigorous scientific data, they are scientific data. And it make me tend to believe that this is a very good crop coming up. Let's have a look then at Cambodia. So really what we've seen in Cambodia following a very good crop last year. So as we came into the year, last year's crop was about 840,000 tonnes. That was a pretty good crop. Crop has been growing, more trees have been coming online. Yields last year weren't particularly outstanding, but enough more additional trees came online to boost the crop up around this 840,000 level. This year, the early season situation was that the January-February outturn, so you do get a crop starting maybe even in December. Most of it comes February, March, April, but the January-February outturns were lower than expected. There was quite a dry December. We've had some rains since, and that was reflected in prices. So early season prices were around about 6,000 real. That's 1,400, 1,460 US dollars a ton at the farm gate. Remember, in Cambodia, prices are quoted undried at the farm gate. Most exports are made before the nuts are dried and bagged. This week, prices have slipped back. 5,450, that's about $1,300 per ton for undried RCN. So arrivals have improved. Some rains in February have helped. There is a disagreement on that. Some people say that the rains damaged, other people say that they helped. The market tells us in terms of price movement that they helped. Now, I would suggest that looking at the situation now, what we're seeing is that the early estimates of a very big crop, around about 900,000 tonnes, and those were official estimates, that is probably looking a little bit optimistic at this point. The yields, particularly early season yields, may be down somewhat, but there are more trees coming into production. So we get yields down a little bit, more trees coming into production. That would start to get people thinking about maybe a crop similar to last year. I've spoken to a lot of friends in Cambodia. I work with a project there called the EU-German CapSafe project, which is a development project on cashews in the country. And spoken to a lot of stakeholders. And what I hear is about the same as last year, maybe a little bit lower. Not a major problem, but needs to be watched. That's going to reveal itself in the coming 3 or 4 weeks. But we do know that the markets come down. That suggests more material available. More material means the crop is coming in now. Looking at India, it is actually early in India. There was a time when this would be well into the crop, but it is early. If we look at the Indian situation, so India, as you know, is massive grower of cashews which are consumed in the country. The average production over 5 years is calculated at about 718,000 tonnes. That places India third in the world after Cote d'Ivoire and Cambodia. The record crop is about 880,000 tonnes or thereabouts. So what we're looking at is the crop started, arrivals are moderate. What we see is that raw cashew nut prices are higher than last year, but that the prices remain in line with the kernels market. So the RCN prices they've risen by roughly the same amount as kernels prices. And I understand demand in India is steady enough for the time of year. Now, I think in time we are going to see a huge boost in Indian demand for cashew kernels, but that's probably not for this year, that's for the years to come. Early forecast, and this was from the All India Cashew Association, forecasting a crop of somewhere between 775 and 800,000 tonnes. That was at the Indian dried fruit event, Mewa India in Bombay, and also repeated at the World Cashew Conference. So a little bit old, getting a few weeks old, this estimate now, but we don't see anything that would suggest any major problems. So that's the three major countries. Let's have a quick update on Africa. Mozambique, I mentioned Mozambique unusually in April, but again, we see an increase in the crop estimate for the current crop, the 2024-2025 crop, which is now estimated to be 40% up. That's a record crop. Nigeria, the news I'm hearing is that they're waiting for the second crop, a little bit of a hiatus between the two. There's so many stories going around. Some people talking about heat damaging the crop, some saying that the rain is damaging the crop, some saying the rain is good for the crop. The market price has been rising. That's been driven by foreign exchange. There is a lot of material flowing in across the border from Benin. It's really difficult to work this out. My guess is you're looking at a pretty decent crop in Nigeria this year, but you have particular strains in the country, in the economy, and in the methods of trade, which is causing some stress in the RCN business. Benin still looks like a good crop. Estimates, I haven't heard any change in the estimates. Looks good. Cross-border smuggling is a major factor still into Nigeria, into Togo. This is due to the ban on RCN. And it's not because the government doesn't want to enforce the ban. It's simply because it's a really difficult job and it's not going very well. So material is creeping out. You would have to ask, is that not necessary? Because simply there isn't enough processing capacity in the country to absorb a crop like this. Ghana, prices have fallen, second crop coming along, looks like good quality. Prices have fallen. We had these wild early season prices, 23 CDs. That's back to around about the minimum or the guide price, around about $960. Good quality raw material. Crop looks better. Official estimates suggest a good crop this year. I'm going with that. I think it is a good crop. Guinea, Republic of Guinea, this could be big. This could be a big crop. Now, there has been some weather disruption in some areas, but all indicators are that the crop was very good ahead of that. I find it difficult to decipher exactly the situation, so I listened to some good people on the ground there, and they are telling me this looks like a good crop. Maybe, a little bit less than the 200,000 tons that was originally talked about, but still a good crop, and export trade is steady and buyers are active there. So maybe buyers have been active in Guinea and waited to get more involved in Cote d'Ivoire following the events of last year and that export ban imposed. Burkina Faso, again, no reason to think that there's any difficulty with the crop. Prices are steady, prices possibly a little bit high, probably a little bit higher than can be sustained in the market. But there are the estimates range up as high as 200,000 tons. I don't buy that. I think looking at trade, I think that crop's about 130,000 tons. About 12% of that will be processed locally, maybe a little bit less this year. One or two factories have trouble. And there may be a slow arrival to the market because of additional border. I wrote restrictions, but additional bureaucracy is more likely than restrictions. Guinea-Bissau, well, we hear crop looks good, progressing well. Minor changes in the tax system from what I can see, but not enough to make any huge differences on prices. So we could be looking at a more normal crop in Guinea-Bissau, and the incentives to ship that through the port of Bissau mean that is likely to happen, meaning that trade through Senegal will be much like last year. On the other hand, the downside of shipping through Bissau is that it's not an easy port and the market will receive the raw cash nuts a little bit more slowly. And that's important, but it's mostly important to people who are interested in specifically Guinea-Bissau quality, which is high quality and processes very well. Togo, I don't normally talk about Togo because it's a relatively small producer, but with the the developments of the sector there, I'm going to start talking about Togo a little bit more. What we are seeing is this influx of raw material from Benin. We're seeing steady prices, a good crop, although what the local production absolutely is difficult to ascertain because of the movement of raw cashew nuts cross-border. And exports are due to start this week, so that material will come to market. So overall, across the continent of Africa, we're seeing good indicators on crop size, good indicators on crop quality. Trade in RCN hasn't yet settled down. Sales of kernels are pretty good. Sales of, particularly to the European market, particularly sales of what might be described as certified or sustainable, well-managed cashew kernels, sales have been really good. And I would suggest that imports into Europe this year will be higher from West Africa than they were last year. More of that in a little while. So let's look at world production then. And if you've been with us before, you'll know the way I like to look at it. I look at a high estimate and I look at a low estimate, an optimistic and a pessimistic estimate for all the countries, and I come together with a crop estimate. So over the past 2 weeks, I've slightly revised my estimate down. I'm a little bit less optimistic on Cambodia. I'm also a little bit less optimistic on Vietnam's crop. But overall, I think we are looking at a very good crop, probably the highest crop in history on what we know now. So that would mean a crop which significantly exceeds 2024 and even exceeds the previous record of 2023. And that would be logical based on the weather that we've seen, based on the trees coming into production in Cambodia, for example, and the trends in West Africa. So it may not be the 5.8 million tons, but I think it's going to be up there around that level. So an optimistic outlook for production. Overall then, summarizing on production, what we see is generally favorable weather with some isolated problems in certain areas. Those isolated problems, be careful because they tend to get more airtime than they deserve. Cambodia, what will be the impact of this later crop? It does look like it's a later crop rather than a smaller crop. What's the impact of that in the market? It tends to ease cash flow concerns. It does mean perhaps that Vietnamese processors can come a little bit later to West Africa, allowing time possibly for prices to moderate on raw cashew nuts. West Africa, we've been talking about it. We're going to watch this closely. I think it's a big crop. How big is big? So is Côte d'Ivoire, for example, going to hit the previous record level up around 1.4 million, or will it be, as the official estimates indicating, 1.2 million tons? The difference is significant. India looks good, coming in, needs to be watched. Watch the weather, watch the impact of recent rains, watch the impact of potentially all of those things that can happen at this time of year. We're early April, so there is time to go. Storms, early monsoons, rains, it can happen. Needs to be watched. So I think, in summary, minimum crop for this year is the same as 2023. It could be 8 to 10% higher. It could be, therefore, a record crop. So we've talked about demand and we've talked about the potential impact on demand of higher prices, tariffs, the trade war, the economic uncertainty, but also the other side of the coin, which is that forward cover isn't as extensive as previously. People have prices to protect, and raw cashew nuts, and indeed inventories at destinations for processing, doesn't really favour lower prices. So I think we're still looking at, if we want to talk about price, we're still looking at a fairly limited range, and I definitely do not see a return to the kind of prices that we saw in the first half of 2024. More likely that we see prices within the current range. As I said, we're going to talk about processing in Africa. So I want to give you a profile of where African cashew processing is and how it's progressed and where it's likely to go. So let's dig into some of the numbers. If we look at the total African cashew processing, we see tremendous growth. We see 21% annual growth between 2019 and 2024. Most of that growth is, of course, in West Africa. Côte d'Ivoire is the major player. But East Africa too has seen growth. And we are beginning to see something of a recovery in Mozambique in the last 2 years, more profitability, better operations. And we are beginning to see the dawning of a new period of processing development in Tanzania. Very positive growth, very strong growth, and the trend suggests that this is likely to continue. If we look at the key measurement, which we often adopt, is how much of the crop is processed. So if we looked at India, for example, we would see India's processing something like 200% of its production because it imports. When we look in Africa, what we see in 2024 is about 17% of the crop. Now we're talking across the whole continent, but about 17% of all the crops are processed at origin in African countries. And that's pretty good. When you look at the trend, you can see that it's been steadily upward since 2009. You can see a little interruptions here and there, but generally speaking, it's been going up. Growth slowed during the COVID period, but post-COVID we've seen fast growth. And the last 2 years particularly, you're going to see steps up. So you tend to see big steps up now because factories tend to be much larger scale, and especially in West Africa, the new factories tend to be large factories. So you don't get slow, you get step-by-step growth, and that's what we're seeing. If we look at the countries that lead, so I put them all in here, right? I know it's not the clearest of charts, but just look at the general trend. So what we're seeing is leading countries. We're excluding Côte d'Ivoire. It needs a chart all of its own because the scale here is up to 60,000. The biggest is 52,500 in Benin. Côte d'Ivoire is over 300,000, so it's on a separate chart. So if we take the group of following countries, this is what we get. So if we take Mozambique as a good example, so Mozambique processing had been rising through the manual period, through the semi-mechanized period, continued upwards, hit a little bit of a crisis, particularly during COVID, particularly when raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices were out of line. It fell away, and now we're beginning to see the recovery again. If we look in Benin, for example, we see steady growth falling away as it was very difficult to be competitive in processing 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and then the Arise project has kicked in, and we see a big spike up from last year, and we're going to see another spike up in the coming year. It may not be the perfect project, it may not be the perfect organization of a sector, but it is definitely increasing processing, whatever way we look at it. Similarly, countries where we basically have no regulation. So we look at Benin with high regulation, we look at Mozambique with support, moderate regulation, and we look at Nigeria and Ghana with relatively light, or in case of Nigeria, no regulation of the sector, but we still see growth in processing. Nigeria is the green bars, and if you follow the trend, it's pretty strong. So what I'm saying is that over all of these countries, we have seen growth in processing. And it's really kicked off with the availability of mechanized solutions. Growth rates since mechanization became readily available. And although that goes back a long way in Vietnam, in Africa, we're really only talking about from the middle of the last decade onwards, we see it move up. Now, most of these countries offer investment incentives. I think all of them offer some form of tax incentive. They offer other things, free import of machines for cashew processing, assistance with expatriate management and other factors. But very few of them have cashew specific factors. If we look at Cote d'Ivoire, we see a different situation. We see direct subsidy of the industry and we see huge growth. And you see that that growth has kicked in since the introduction of the current support regime and the attractiveness of Cote d'Ivoire for cashew investment. So you have the subsidies and the incentives there. On the other side, you have a much lower quality raw cashew nut than you would have available in countries like Benin or Ghana, for example. But in 2024, 60% or just over 60% of African cashew processing was in Cote d'Ivoire. To put that into perspective, the country produces about a third of Africa's cashews. So it produces a third of Africa's cashews in 2024, but processed 60%. So it's clear that at this level, 344,000 tons of processing, and it will again be higher this year, that indicates really strong growth. There are questions, and we might come to those in a moment. African cashew processing is driven by success in the European market. In 2024, African processors had a 20% share of the European market. That puts them in second place after Vietnam, which still dominates at 72%, but there's more African cashews consumed in Europe than Brazil, India, Indonesia, and all of the countries combined. This at 38,114 tons of kernels imported. This is pretty good achievement, and you can see this has been happening for some time. The big moves 2021, actually during COVID, and it's picked up from there. And that's for two reasons. One, Europeans are closer to West Africa, and two, processing and quality certified or food safety certified, at least cashew kernels became available. EU plus UK imports grew at 6.8% in the 10 years to 2024. Africa's share grew at 23%, almost 4 times the average growth. And at the moment, there's no reason to think that that won't continue. So the argument in favor of location and sustainable processing, vis-a-vis Europe at least, is very strong. But if we look in the other market, where you might think that African cashew kernels would be successful, we see a different story. Growth in terms of market share has essentially stalled in the United States. So we're looking here at the percentage share, 7.1% share in 2024, just under 7% in 2022. So after an initial improvement, we're seeing stagnation. In fact, if we go back all the way to 2013, 2014, we see a market share of about 6.25%. Not too far distant from 2023, and only marginally below what we saw in 2024. And it's an interesting thought, but Europeans bought 3 times more cashew kernels from Africa than Americans did in 2024, despite the fact that the two destination markets are roughly the same size. The US market is bigger, if anything. So we're looking at a situation where the location, quality, sustainability is beating price in Europe, which is not to say Europeans will pay any price. They're looking for value, but they're also prepared to pay for these other factors. Whereas in the US market, it appears that it's being difficult for African processors to break in, mainly because they need higher prices, and the US market has become very price focused. It's interesting because if we go back to this period, 2013 to 2018, American companies were very active in West Africa. You would regularly meet in West Africa, American companies looking to source. That's much less so now. It's much more looking toward the European market. So what are the attractions of buying in West Africa? Why has this worked? And I think, first of all, there is increasing and improving cost competitiveness. Now, it's not the obvious thing. It's not that you can say that African factories can process at the same cost as Vietnamese factories. They can't. And it's unlikely that they'll be able to do so in the foreseeable future. But they do have far lower supply chain costs. So if you think of Vietnam importing 60% of its raw cashew nuts from African countries, particularly West Africa, and the costs associated with that, or Indian factories importing 60% of their raw cashew nuts from African countries and the costs associated with that. So we're talking about assembly costs, trading costs, shipping costs, export tax, finance costs, landing costs, delivery costs, and so on. Not to mention market volatility. What we're seeing is that the overall assembly cost for raw material is much higher at destination. That tends to offset, to a large extent, the higher processing operating costs. Why are processing operating costs higher? Well, they have the difficulties of being new businesses, number one. They have higher costs of utilities, particularly power. They have not yet exploited the byproducts, especially shell and cashew nut shell liquid, as they might do. And for many, marketing is not as efficient as it might be, but these are evolving. And what we see, for example, we already are seeing in India, and this is a slight aside, but in India, we're seeing mechanization really taking hold now, and we're seeing that the average cost for a large-scale mechanized factory in India is much lower than for the more traditional factories. So it's a work in progress, but for now, cost competitiveness is based on offsetting higher processing operational costs against lower supply chain costs. Doesn't fully offset, but it does get African cashews into a range where they can compete, especially in higher quality markets. Second, facility of those factories in recent years to meet buyers' requirements. Generally, you're looking at a lighter color, better quality product. It's also fresher. Supply chain that's less complex and nearer to the market. Clearly, West African cashew processors are the nearest to the North American or the European markets. East African also have advantages, particularly in the Middle Eastern market. Traceability is much easier, and it's an important buyer requirement now, and it's much easier to implement in an origin-based processing. Factories tend to be modern because they're new. They tend to be modern and mechanized in larger scale factories, which gives them an advantage. Food safety is a key factor. The food safety in those modern factories is good. The certification is genuine, and we can see the results of that in the tests. And of course, the other aspect is that having an alternative, not being the dominant supplier, being a second supplier, if you like, that reduces risk for buyers. So some buyers see that and they will support it. Overall, when we look at the general trend, West African suppliers, Tanzanian suppliers, Mozambique suppliers are now in a position where they can meet buyers' requirements. And as particularly in Europe, where more and more social and environmental responsibility requirements are coming into the law, it's easy to see how only origin processed cashew nuts can meet those requirements. Is it possible to implement full traceability for the international trade in raw cashew nuts? Well, it may be, but it hasn't been done yet. So how this in the longer term works, will we see a situation where African processors focus on their close markets and Vietnamese processors focus on their close markets, or perhaps add more value, remains to be seen. When we look at location, we can see that location means more than just shorter transit. So it certainly means shorter transit times. So I picked Ghana in this case and just calculated minimum transit times to the various markets, and the percentage those markets consume you can see, compared to transit from India or transit from Vietnam into those markets. The 35 days doesn't change, by the way, if you go trans-Pacific as opposed to this direction. It's for illustration purposes only. Close to market means, yes, lower freight, but it also means shorter shipment times. That means that buyers need less inventory. If you can reorder and have that product with you in 30 days, that means you need to keep less inventory than if it takes 60 or 75 days to get it there. The kernels themselves are fresher and therefore have a longer shelf life. But it also means, because you need less inventory, you need less working capital. So it has a direct impact on the bottom line. Location is important. Location is making a difference. If we look at, again, really here we're talking about the ability to meet buyers' requirements. So we're looking at what might be termed a sustainable supply chain. We're looking also at an alternative. It reduces the risk of a single supplier. It allows buyers to meet their environmental and social responsibility requirements. It's an opportunity for investors, and it has the added impact of supporting livelihoods and a better future for smallholder families. So one can see the reasons why European buyers, particularly driven by demands from supermarkets and consumers, would tend to focus a little bit more on West Africa. It does mean slightly higher cost kernels, but you have all of those advantages too. What created this change? Well, I think about this and I look at it and I think, well, mechanization played a big part. Mechanization, okay, it increased your capital investment, but it also shortened the time for market entry. No longer is it necessary to train thousands of people in cashew processing. Increased production in the region, obviously. Rising supply chain costs had also a big impact. So that if your freight is higher, if fuel prices are higher, if it's more expensive to move kernels 30,000 kilometers, it's logical. Don't do that. Process them close to origin. And those rising supply chain costs have acted as a catalyst for processing in Africa. Responsibility and sustainability, I've mentioned already. The economic arguments are as strong as those. We shouldn't just think that African processing is about responsible and sustainable processing. It is, but it also makes sense in terms of cost. The impact of development projects has been huge across the sector, and so has supportive government policy. It's not by accident that Côte d'Ivoire processes 60% of the cashews processed in Africa. Those are some of the catalysts. That is why, since 2018, we've seen this boom in African cashew processing. Big issues, though, are still there, and there are significant issues. I think underutilization of capacity. So I think we calculated last year only about 56% of the so-called installed capacity was being utilized. Management, the right managers, training of managers, availability of managers is a major problem for processors, as it would be in any growing industry. Marketing is an issue too. Few African cashew factories have good marketing functions. Few actually market on their competitive advantages, and unfortunately far too many end up arguing about price when there are so many other factors that make them attractive as suppliers. The availability of money, working capital. So I call it the 3 M's: management, marketing, money. These are the 3 big issues that impact underutilization of capacity and slow the progress of the sector. Also, in most cases, the supply chain linkages to the growers aren't yet there. So whereas we can talk about traceability, delivering it is a different matter, and that needs supply chain linkages to be built. Ideally, processors should be connected to farmer groups, individual farmers or cooperatives. In too many cases, they're connected via traders. The traders perform a valuable function, but they don't offer those kind of linkages, understanding mutual exchange on quality or opportunities for supportive growers. And finally, I call it surviving government policy, because if you are heavily supported by a government, and we know this in Europe from many years ago, if you're heavily supported by the government, that can breed in inefficiency to your business. So for many, and I think there are existing examples of this, for many, just surviving the fact that the subsidy that supported the life of the factory for so long will be one day withdrawn. And I'm not saying that that will be this year or next year, but it will be one day withdrawn. Means you have to prepare for that. You need to make sure that your business isn't just built on subsidies, on support, that it can't stand alone. So there are big issues in African processing, but there's huge success, and that is continuing to grow. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we saw processing this year grow again by something like 20%. So we've talked about markets, we've talked about African processing. I hope I've put some context on those for you. I hope you found it interesting. Let's go back to Stella now and see if we've got any comments or questions.
Thank you, Jim, for the great presentation. Yes, we have questions. To dive into them, we have seen some variation in the price per ton of cashew nuts between major producing countries in Vietnam, India, and Cote d'Ivoire. Can you help us understand what factors contribute to this variation in prices?
Variation in prices are often down to location, quality, but also down to policy and the way the market is structured. So cashew kernels prices in India are much higher than other countries because India has a structure of a market which doesn't allow imports. So what's happening now, for example, is Indian processing is remodeling itself to become more competitive for the domestic market. In Vietnam, we had a different situation where the efficient mechanized processing allowed costs to come down, and for some time prices came down too. So basically the differences in prices between areas are location, which means cost, quality, which impacts the value of the kernels, local regulation, consumption, distance from markets, efficiency, cost of utilities, a whole range of factors. I think across production, we don't see as many differences, but we do see, for example, high yielding countries like Cambodia, where the average yield per hectare is 1.42 tons. That obviously affects price and cost and all of those factors related, compared, let's say relate that to countries in West Africa where probably the highest yield is something like 650 kilos per hectare and the average is around about 450. So a whole range of factors contribute to that. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. We are also hearing more about a drop in outturn and potential crop concerns. Is this just a speculation, or are these issues more real than what we think? What's your take on this?
So there's a couple of factors at play here. We are seeing lower outturn in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, because that happens every year. That is a fact. So certain parts of the country have higher outturns than other parts of the country. That's normal, that's regular. That is not to say that there is any necessarily indication of a change in the typical trend. We may be seeing lower outturns in Cambodia this year. Not conclusive on that, but there's a lot of rumors. And, you know, in a relatively quiet market, people will fill the space with rumor and myth and gossip. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now. Yes, I probably would agree that the crop estimates are a little bit lower. We've marked down our own estimate a little than they were 3 weeks ago, but I don't see any major factor. And I would say really important to try to distinguish the rumor from the fact, to try and base decision making on facts insofar as we can. Stella?
We are also seeing a sudden decline in arrivals from Nigeria and Ghana. Could this be a sign that perhaps we are too optimistic about the crop sizes this year? What's your perspective?
My perspective is that we're between the first and second crops in many cases. That shouldn't be taken as an indicator of crop loss or failure at all. Give it 2 more weeks, then have another look.
Okay. And for our last question, we are moving back to Cote d'Ivoire. The farm gate price of the RCN is currently $701 per ton. What factors are driving this price in 2025?
I think the first factor is that the minimum price is set at the 425, and that is stopping prices going down any further as they might otherwise would. Prices were early on supported by good demand from processors who wanted to buy the higher quality raw material early in the season before exports could take place. Now, as we get into April, we're going to see more and more focus on exports, and it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the farm gate price. But the farm gate price is tending toward the minimum level. It is tending toward the 425. Therefore, we're pretty much at the bottom of at least where the market can trade legally. And therefore, I don't see any real pressure. I don't see any real downward pressure on that for the time being. But given the kernels market, nor do I see much upward pressure. So I don't think anyone can pay too much more at the farm gate. It's a tight calculation. You know, the farm gate price was set quite high this year by the government. It looks like that's worked. We'll see over time, but it may be difficult to defend the farm gate price as the year goes on if the crop turns out to be as good as we think it might be.
Thank you very much, Jim. What should we expect for the next GME?
What should we expect? Well, let's have a look at some summary on what we're looking at. I think now as we get to April, the outlook has changed a little bit. I think where we are right now is the existing stocks of raw cashew nuts match demand as it is. Kernels prices are around about the 10-year average, as I said, about 11% higher than the 2-year average and 27% higher than last year. That's not going to bring anyone racing into the market. There is more kernels inventory at destination. I think people brought kernels in voluntarily because they saw prices low. There was a risk of the introduction of import tariffs, even though that might be a low risk. And in a way, they were also forced to bring in additional stock due to the contract. Lower forward cover, but that is gradually being taken. Tenders have been completed. Forward cover is now progressing. We are seeing people in the market. The crops look good. The risk of any form of crop failure is easing. The questions that are there, I think they're there around Cambodia, because information is very slow to come in Cambodia, although it remains relatively optimistic, and India, because it's at an early stage. There's no suggestion from the pricing, if we look in Cambodia or in India or elsewhere, there's no suggestion in the pricing in the markets that there's a problem with the crops at the moment. Raw cashew nut prices are still mismatched against kernels, but that mismatch, when we look at it, interestingly, is less than it was in 2024. That's really not a great deal of consolation for processors who are trying to make sense of all of this and trying to make some money out of it. But it might suggest that there is an option or a room, let's say, for a little decline in raw cashew nut prices in the coming weeks to try and match the kernels. I think the chances of kernels going significantly upwards is limited. I think the chances of kernels dropping down into the kind of region that we were in last year is also very unlikely. So I think we're going to trade in a range. I think that that's good for business. And I think what really is needed now is a little recalibration of our CN prices to match kernels so buyers can get on with buying their kernels. I think that the West African situation in terms of policy, I'm going to call it meddling because I can't really come up with a better word, but the kind of ad hoc policy measures that we've seen every now and again, and we saw last year, the likelihood for that is receding. I don't think we're going to see that. I think it's a mix of processors having acted and covered what they need, and also I think regulators having learned some valuable lessons from last year. So overall, for April, don't see any reason for significant volatility. I think there will be continued modest buying of kernels. Demand will suffer, but demand will not be decimated unless we see some dramatic economic developments or something else. RCN prices probably will slip back. Interesting period, but nothing like the suggestion of the kind of volatility that we saw last year. But keep an eye on this because still questions, especially India, especially Cambodia. Keep an eye on what's going on there in terms of production. Any other questions, Stella? I see a few in the chat, but I think we've probably answered most of them.
Yes, one has dropped in between. If we can take it, we are hearing that Nigeria has a second flowering and it is not happening. There may be also a second one in Ghana and Nigeria.
Well, if there's no second flowering in Nigeria and Ghana, that would be the first time in history that there's been no second flowering in those two countries. There may be reduced flowering, there may be very good flowering, but there will be flowering. That's a fact. So I think this kind of comment that there's no flowering, there's no crop, there's a failure, guys, this is not the way to work in this market. This is destructive. It's not going to work in the future on myths and rumors. More and more people have the ability to see what's going on. So if you don't see flowers on the trees that you expected, wait a week or two. If you don't see the crop coming in, wait a week or two, because it looks like that's what we're seeing this year. So
There is another question. Are there chances of the record crop resulting in a depression of prices across the board?
well, that's exactly what we've been trying to discuss over the past 90 minutes or so. And I would say that, yes, there is a chance of a record crop. Depression of prices is, it sounds like a question that whether or not prices could go to the historically low levels of last year. I do not see that. Could prices get a little bit lower? Yeah, they could. Is there a depression? So depression means a huge collapse of prices. No chance, in my view. Absolutely no chance of that. If that were likely to happen, it would already have. I don't see it happening.
Yes, Jim, another question. Tanzania and Mozambique have less of a logistics advantage to EU due to the Red Sea. How do you see this affecting processes?
Well, I think in the case of Tanzania, there is a tremendous opportunity to focus on the market in the Middle East, which will absorb significant volumes of high quality cashew kernels. But we also see buyers in Europe buying from Tanzania. The logistical advantage in terms of cost isn't a huge factor. There is a logistical disadvantage compared to West Africa in terms of the time taken for shipments. So I think that processors in East Africa need to, A, produce really good kernels, which they are capable of, and secondly, focus on markets that appreciate those. So for Tanzania, it might be buyers that are interested in a lighter color, more an Indian style cashew, if I can say that, and they might see good opportunities in the markets of West Asia. For Mozambique, there are opportunities in markets in Asia, but also markets opportunities in Europe. The logistical advantage for high value products like cashews, values in the $7,500 a ton, logistical cost disadvantages are less impactful than they would be on lower value commodities, for example, peanuts. Interesting questions today, Stella, aren't they? Stella, I think you're muted.
Another question just dropped from my end, Jim.
Okay.
An observation, in India, the crop this year is also lower like it was in 2024. The first crop was not as good as the second flowering, and the crop can be 70-50 to 800,000. But I strongly disagree. Last year crop was about 35% lower, and this year is still be at 40% lower.
Well, thank you for that information, Vikram. It's a very interesting opinion. And of course, you could be right. That's why we need to always keep an eye on the situation as it develops in India. It's not what I'm hearing now, but let's wait and see. What would it mean? I'm 35% lower than what? So I guess we're talking about lower than the 2023 crop, or lower than the prediction of 750 to 800,000 by the All India Cashew Association. Yeah, but the other thing I think nowadays is that, thank you, Vikram, he's just clarified that he means lower than the 750. India has quite a diverse production area. It will be interesting to see how that sets forward, but I do say it's nowadays the last of the major origins to harvest, so we do keep a close eye on it. If I were looking at it, I would just on what I hear, I think 40% lower, so 40% lower than 750. Nah, I don't think so. I can't see that. Maybe in some areas, but I certainly can't see that all India wise. Vikram, it's good. Thank you for your contribution. It's really interesting. We might continue that discussion next time when we have more information from India.
Thank you, Jim. I think we've now fully exhausted the questions in the chat and also the comments from our participants. We would like to especially thank you for the 77th Global Market Encounter. The next GME will be on the 16th of April.
Let me just add my thanks to everyone. I see a lot of people online today. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's asked questions. And thanks to you, Stella, for moderating this event. See you next time. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Jim. And we are also thanking our partners and sponsors, to mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Movecom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and cashewinformation.com. Let me also remind you that registration for the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is still ongoing, with a 40% discount available on all conference rates. The networking platform remains available. Enjoy the rest of your session.